statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I would like to express condolences to the brotherly people of New Zealand in the wake of the horrible tragedy in Christchurch. We condemn this crime. It needs to be investigated and prevent any such acts in future. We do hope that all of those who have been injured will mend very quickly. Mr. Chairman, there was a very good storyteller, Lewis Carroll, and his most famous story is Alice in Wonderland. It describes a girl who is describing her dreams and passing them off as reality. And I'm under the impression that the meeting today is also conducted by similar Alices. They are telling us about what it is that they're imagining. And what they're imagining are things which are horrible and appalling. Over the 5 years since the moment of the so-called Revolution of Dignity, but in actual fact from the moment of the coup d'etat in Kiev, the number of such storytellers in Ukraine and around Ukraine, their number has grown. Ms. Bakali, who is participating in such a meeting for the second time running, I think should be given a prize because you're clearly literary gifted and you have a rich imagination. But Mr. Chichos is gaining up on you because he is also artistically gifted. We have nothing against fairy tales, even scary tales. After all, this is a distinct literary genre. But the problem here is that the tales, consciously or not, are taken by our impressionable partners as its face value, and they're used as basis for conclusions and actions. Let's conduct an experiment here. Raise your hand if you have visited the Crimea after its reunification with the Russian Federation. Raise your hand. All clear. Yeah, yes. Very well. Well, that's all very clear, and I do apologize, but you've already an opportunity to speak, and we did hear what you said. I personally visited Crimea 3 times, once when it was Ukrainian, twice after it became Russian. So, and I can make comparisons. But the question to you is this: what is the basis on which you can judge the life in the territory which you never visited, about which you know nothing, and about which you don't want to find anything out? What's stopping you visiting Crimea? And despite the nonsense that we have heard, and not for the first time, Crimea is a completely open Russian region. And we invite everyone to come there because we have absolutely nothing to hide. If you have a Russian visa, it's no problem going there. Ukraine, by the way, since the summer of 2015, have not been allowing foreigners to travel to Crimea, but there are other ways of going there. Mark, my dear Mark, we're asking everyone to come to Crimea, but they don't want to cut, probably because they're afraid of seeing something that will be very difficult to describe negatively thereafter. Furthermore, the guests at this resort are very welcome. Last year alone, the growth in the number of visitors was 28%, and 6.8 million people visited Crimea. Out of them, by the way, 1 million are Ukrainians, and their number of Ukrainians goes up by 200,000 every year, by the way. Many come to this region year in, year out, and the return of the region to Russia did not make them change their habits. Nor are they put off by the need to spend hours in queues on the border between Ukraine and Crimea. But we welcome their visits. In order to understand whether or not they like the Crimea, all you need to do is go and look it up in the social networks. If you give yourself the trouble to do that, then you will see a completely different picture, the opposite of the scary tale which you're being force-fed by the organizers of the show today. We do understand the Kievan authorities do not like this because it hampers their lies about the dire situation of this Russian region. Rada, for example, in 2018 has a draft banning Ukrainian officials from visiting Crimea because, and I quote one of the Ukrainian mass media, because so as make sure that they cannot talk about the favorable situation on the peninsula. the number of foreign delegations visiting Crimea is not going down either. For example, currently a delegation from France is visiting. It's headed by the president of the French-Russian Dialogue Association and the former Minister of Transport of France, Thierry Mariani. And these are some of the things that he said to the media. He said that prior to 2014, the Crimea was a land in everlasting sleep. Now the Crimea has dashed forward, and I think that the changes compared to the first meeting in 2015 are fantastic. So, my dear Francois, as you can see, your assessments and the assessments made by your highly placed compatriot are substantially different. And the reason here is that you, unlike him, never visited Russian Crimea. So please come and you will see everything with your own eyes. So, what can possibly the Crimeans be unhappy with? The region is actively developing, prospering, is attracting growing levels of investment. The real salaries of the Crimeans more than tripled. Their purchasing power doubled. The pensions went up by a factor of 2.5, and the purchasing power of the elderly, therefore, went up by a factor of 1.5. The rate of mortality went down by 7.5%, child mortality by 40%. New medical centers are being opened, new schools, new kindergartens. And despite the affected concern on the part of Ukraine about the Crimea, they pay lip service to that, but in actual fact, they organize transport, water, and energy blockade of the region. But despite that, the region today is basically self-sufficient and very closely linked with the remainder of Russia. 3/4 of the human settlements are supplied with gas. A new electric power plant is working. It ended major power cuts. And a new energy projects are in the pipeline. Water supply is organized. The new Crimean bridge, the beautiful one, is there. There is road traffic there, soon to be followed by train traffic. The international airport in Simferopol has been modernized, or to be more precise, rebuilt again. Where was Ukrainian support about Crimea before 2014? This used to be a depressed, undeveloped region. A pariah of sorts within the Ukraine, only good for spending summers there in order to soak in its gentle sea waters. As of 2015, we have a special federal program for the peninsula for socioeconomic development, and the funding there is $15 billion, and it's to continue up to 2022. As a result of this program, we managed to increase the level of state support to agriculture tenfold. The funding for education tripled, of culture went up by a factor of 3.5, of sports quadrupled. The gross regional product grew by 1.5. For the purpose of comparison, from 2019 to 2013, the industrial production level in Crimea decreased by 5%. Let me not quote any more figures. Let me just summarize and say that if one single region of Ukraine after Maidan had received of what the Crimea has already received, well, then Ukrainians would probably have shown greater support to their current president, who spends his time by accusing Russia for the failure of his policies. And I would like to, by the way, recall something for the benefit of those who are shedding crocodile tears today because of the unenviable, so-called unenviable fate of the Crimean Tatars. Before Crimea became part of Russia, there was no Crimean Tatar autonomy on the peninsula. And Kiev really could not care less about the Crimean Tatars. And I think if the Crimean Tatars present here were honest, that would remember that. And now, after 2014, the Crimean Tatars all of a sudden became the most precious citizens for Kiev. All of a sudden, people remember them. And this is because such convenient remote witnesses such as you, Mr. Chigos, is something that Kiev needs very much today. The Crimean Tatar community was subject to discrimination. The land issue was unresolved, and it was a very difficult one because the Ukrainian authorities encouraged land grabs. The Crimean Tatar community today is represented at all levels of authorities in Crimea, and this is proportionate to their share of the population. Its interest is being defended by more than 30 NGOs, and the numbers are of those is about 30,000 people. There are 3 official languages on the peninsula: the Russian, Ukrainian, Crimean Tatar. All international problems only exist in the imagination, first and foremost, of those who fled the peninsula and who justify their existence today by inventing various tall tales about the life of Crimean ethnicities. The Crimean Tatars who live in the Crimea today and would like to describe the real situation are not welcome at meetings such as the one we're having today. You probably noticed that in the concept note, the organizers point out that speaking is by invitation only. And obviously, there was no such invitation received in the Crimea. Instead of that, what we have is in front of us people who know about the Crimea from the stories of those who had left the Crimea. So it's very difficult to say that they paint the real picture of what is happening in the peninsula. Mr. Chairman, the people in the Crimea probably do have one reason for discontent. And it's because the main part of the international community, at the instigation of the Maidan authorities, are trying to pretend that the Crimeans as such do not exist. And what we have in the prosperous peninsula is a Russian prison of the nations with Ukrainians and Tatars who are longing for Kiev. And that is why, in particular, there is visa discrimination, unacceptable visa discrimination against the Crimeans, which is similar to the discrimination by nationality. It is not clear how this can tally with European values. And this is, of course, a pity, but everything is relative. And I'm saying this because the Crimeans have in front of their eyes the example of Donbass, where a lower share of Russian-speaking people live. But simply because these people wanted to keep their identity and revere those heroes who liberated their lands from fascism rather than was a collaborator, because of that, the Kievan authorities are bombing and shelling them. The Crimeans saw the tragedy in Odessa, where about 50 people were burned alive in the trade union house in front of the eyes of a crowd of nationalists run amok. They saw the humiliation of the special forces, Berkut forces, who were doing their duty and who, because of that, were accused of all deadly sins, including murder, and did not give them an opportunity to clear themselves. The Crimeans see the lawlessness which exists in the Ukraine that used to be their country, where no investigations are investigated, where the dissent is suppressed, and everything is because of the imaginary Russian aggression. 5 years ago, after the Maidan junta took over in Kiev, all of the Crimeans and all of the Russian speakers, leaders of Ukraine, heard condemnations and threats against them. Suffice it to recall the words uttered by one of the leaders of Maidan, Dmitry Yarosh, who is still, unless I'm mistaken, a member of the Supreme Rada. He said, the Russian has to be chased out of their Crimea because he will never glorify Bandera. And these are not empty threats. And the people in the peninsula saw that with their eyes when on the 20th of February 2014, a convoy of buses returning from Kiev to the Crimea was attacked by the Ukrainian radical nationalists. On the 27th of February, a friendship train formed by one of the leaders of the neo-Nazis right sector, Igor Moseichuk, left from Kiev for the Crimea. There was a friendship train, and it was a hardened, armed-to-the-teeth nationalists who were going to come down to become friends. Fortunately, they saw the decisive intent of the people on the peninsula and decided to give up on their violent plans. Seeing all of that, remembering all of that, the Crimeans continue being convinced that 5 years ago they made the right decision when they voted for the reunification with Russia. As recently as yesterday, we had the results of the survey amongst the people on the peninsula, and they show that 89% of the Crimeans would vote again for the reunification of Russia if such vote was needed today. Do you think that they are doing that against? Because at gunpoint, the international delegations who are visiting the Crimea do not think so. The Crimeans made the choice for peace and prosperity, the choice for life, after all. And if you acknowledge then, if you understand that all of the disadvantage having to do with the fact that people are telling untruths about them will be relegated to the background. I would like to react to Olga Oprisko today and say that I listened to your emotional statement with a great deal of interest. Please believe me when I say that your father is in safety. He was not safe when he was in November, when he and his colleagues were issued a criminal order to violate the state border of Russia, and not in the area of the Crimea, but in the area where it was a border even before 2014. And the goal of that provocation was to sacrifice the seamen, including your father. But fortunately, they have enough presence of mind not to fulfill the criminal order to the end and surrender. We had to detain them, but not as prisoners of war, but rather people who violated our border, because Russia is not at war with Ukraine. Perhaps Ukraine is in a state of war with Russia, and this is convenient for the powers that be, but we're not. What we need to do now is conduct an investigation, find out who issued the criminal order, which subjected the life of your father to danger. And if guilty of nothing, then after the court proceedings, he will absolutely return to his country, where his safety, unfortunately, will not be guaranteed. Suffice it to remember Nadezhda Savchenko, whom we released, including upon the demands of the international community, who was arrested and is still in prison. For example, she's not allowed to participate in presidential elections. No one, for some reason, does not want to recall that, because she's of no interest to anyone anymore. So what I am advising you to do is to keep in contact with the lawyers you mentioned, because you will need their services once your father is back in Ukraine. I am not going to dwell separately today on why is it that we all, including the Crimeans, think that the referendum 5 years ago is a legitimate one and that we respect its outcome. You will not change your opinion on that anyway, or certainly not today. Because if you do change your opinion, then indirectly you will have to acknowledge that the whole Maidan project is a failure, as it was a disaster for the life of the Ukrainians. And we'll acknowledge that you will have to acknowledge that you use double standards when it comes to self-determination in other parts of Europe and the world. Our legal arguments is something that we've voiced on many an occasion, and I intend to recall them in the upcoming days during conversation with reporters. Mr. Chairman, those who study the modern history of the Crimea knows that the peninsula have a long and persistently, who has always had an autonomous status, been trying to reunify with Russia. Therefore, what happened 5 years ago for the Crimeans was a long-awaited day of joy. And this gave rise to, throughout the peninsula and throughout Russia, to festivities and celebrations which will take place in the upcoming 3 days. And the most important thing for us is the support and enthusiasm of the people of the Crimea, which is felt by everyone who comes to the peninsula with an open heart rather than with an ulterior motive. The most important thing is that we kept the peace and life of more than 2 million Crimeans, and we therefore have no regrets, but I have plenty of things to be proud of. This is the very essence of prevention that you keep talking about. We can see that many in Ukraine are still experiencing phantom pain associated with the Crimea, and appeal to international bodies and governments, and even sometimes find a certain response with them. But this will not change the situation. Ukraine lost the Crimea decisively and irreversibly because of what they themselves had done. And Kiev only has themselves to blame for that. And we call upon the capitals of the organizer countries to stop playing along with the Kievan authorities when they try to dispute the outcome of the people's choice, as expressed 5 years ago. And the quicker this happens, the better it will be for the Ukraine itself. They should stop destroying their own statehood and what little they have left from international relations. Mr. Chairman, we can see that the international community have grown tired from phantom battles surrounding the Crimea. So, in the immediate wake of the Crimea events, about 100 states expressed their support to Kiev. But as the Ukrainians continue pushing forward their yet another provocative resolution in January, there a considerable majority of UN members, 127 states, refused to support it one way or another. We're not calling upon our UN partners in regard to the Crimean topic to start making sure that self-determination becomes a cornerstone at the expense of respecting territorial integrity. Every situation is special and requires its own approach. As I've already mentioned, the fate of the Crimea turned out to be predetermined by what was done by the authorities, the Maidan team that came to power as a result of coup d'etat and their desire to squeeze out the Russian identity from Ukraine. In other words, the fate of the Crimea was a result of, as it were, force majeure circumstances. If you want, then we think that what we did, we saved people from a sinking ship and provided them with a new or an old house. And by the way, this ship is still sinking. So, ladies and gentlemen, please try to deal with the ship before it ends up on the seafloor. We do hope that our Ukrainian neighbors will have enough wisdom and determination to end the lawlessness which unfortunately continues reigning supreme in Ukraine. We do believe that sooner or later we once again will become good neighbors. There is no other way for the peoples of Ukraine and Russia. And the prosperous Russian Crimea, open and hospitable for the Ukrainians and for other visitors, will be a symbol of such good neighborliness. I thank you for your attention.